Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Third Place Books for this wonderful opportunity and for your interest in my new book, American Spartan. I'm grateful for the support of family and friends here today. Let me open with a quote from the beginning of the book by British Army officer T.E. Lawrence, whose deep understanding of the Arab tribes who he fought with in World War I was an important inspiration for this project. "It is their war," Lawrence wrote, "and you are to help them, not to win it for them." I'd like to ask you to indulge me and use your imagination as I take you with me to a faraway place. Imagine that you are in a small village perched on a hillside at the foot of a valley in the Hindu Kush near Afghanistan's border with Pakistan. It is dark and very cold. You are standing under the stars in the open-air courtyard of a traditional mud-walled Afghan compound called a kalat. There's no running water, electricity, or heat. The only light comes from a tiny fire of kindling in the corner of the 30-foot wide by 100-foot long dwelling. A short ways down the hill from the kalat, you see the Konar River snaking silver in the moonlight. Rising directly behind the compound, in the darkness, you can make out the hulking silhouettes of jagged mountains where Taliban insurgents roam freely. Just over the next mountain ridgeline, in a nearby valley, Marcus Luttrell and his 4-man Navy SEAL team were overrun by Taliban fighters in 2005, leaving Luttrell the lone survivor. You know the Taliban still control the high ground and could attack you at any moment. Shivering, you pull a woolen shawl around your shoulders, walk toward the fire, and squat down to warm your hands. A 4-year-old Afghan boy wearing sandals and a dark gray tunic looks up at you with large green eyes. His name is Ishmael, and his father, Abdulwali, sits nearby cradling his AK-47 assault rifle. Abdulwali literally holds your life in his hands. For when the Taliban attack, you will depend on Abdulwali and his fellow tribesmen to protect you. Will he stand up to the Taliban? Something in his eyes tells you that he will. This was the scene one chilly February day in 2012 when I moved into the village in Afghanistan's heavily contested Konar province with about a dozen Afghan tribal police and a dozen American soldiers led by Special Forces Major Gant, a decorated Green Beret who was then my fiancé. The Afghan police, like their commander, Abdulwali, belonged to the fierce Safi tribe, the most powerful in the area. The tribesmen were Pashtuns, members of the large ethnic group with a population of about 40 million people living on either side of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. The kalat we lived in with the Afghans had thick 20-foot walls. Kalat literally means fortress, and it's no wonder that Afghans since ancient times have built their homes like castles, complete with guard towers. A landlocked country in the middle of Central Asia, Afghanistan has long been a crossroads of civilizations, a highway of conquest, from Persians in the 6th century BC to Alexander the Great in 330 BC to the Huns and the Muslim Arabs who by the 11th century had converted the entire area to Islam. Next, about 1200 AD, came Genghis Khan and then the Mughal dynasty that ruled off and on in the 16th and 17th centuries. It wasn't until 1747 that the first semblance of an Afghan nation emerged, a monarchy founded by the ethnic Pashtun tribes. The Pashtuns have long held sway in Afghanistan's highly decentralized state, populating much of the south and east, and the Taliban themselves are primarily Pashtun. But despite the kalat's thick walls, its location backed up against the steep mountainside made it extremely vulnerable to Taliban gunfire. Why were we there? The answer is simple. The kalat stood just a short walk away from the home of the tribal chief, and it was he who decided where we would stay. The tribe surrounded us and protected us from the outside in. So our security resided not in traditional military tactics, but in a strategy of tribal engagement, one Major Gant outlined in his 2009 paper, One Tribe at a Time. Jim's research on the tribes, which drew upon his 2003 deployment commanding a Special Forces team in Konar, had convinced him that sending small U.S. teams to lived in Konar and forge alliances with the tribes could empower them to push the Taliban out of their areas. It was a grassroots approach that he believed could help turn the tide of the Afghanistan war. The culturally savvy U.S. soldiers would grow beards and wear Afghan clothes. They would live, eat, and sleep with the tribesmen, and when necessary, they would fight alongside them. Why was this so powerful? In a word, Pashtunwali, the ancient code of honor that Pashtuns live and die by. Some of you likely watched the movie Lone Survivor or read the book. In it, Navy SEAL Marcus Luttrell's life was saved by a Pashtun tribesman who gave Luttrell safe haven in his village. The villagers fought off the Taliban, who were also Pashtun, to keep the American alive. Then they passed a note to a nearby U.S. base leading to his rescue. The word Pashtunwali appears on the screen at the end of the film. Pashtunwali is a code of ethics, and at its core is honor. One of the main principles of Pashtunwali is Nanawati, which means sanctuary. In other words, it's imperative for the Pashtuns to give a guest refuge against his enemies for as long as he stays. So Luttrell's Afghan hosts honored Nanawati and repelled the Taliban. Jim first learned about the Pashtun Code of Honor during his deployment to Konar in 2003. He learned to speak some basic Pashto and formed his first alliance with an elderly Pashtun tribal leader, Malik Nur Afzal, a great and wise man whose life story is told in my book. Jim also discovered connections between the Pashtun tribal warriors and his own American tribe, his Special Forces teammates, who also valued the honor bestowed by showing bravery on the battlefield. Jim realized that the tribes lived by the Pashtunwali and could be empowered on a much larger scale to help the United States defeat the Taliban, whose strident brand of Islam often conflicted with the tribal ways. And I want to emphasize just as powerfully, Jim saw the potential for this strategy eventually to allow the tribes to peacefully reintegrate some members of the Taliban. So in October 2009, Jim published One Tribe at a Time, just as the Obama administration was conducting a major review of Afghanistan war strategy. The Taliban had been gaining ground for years. The war was at best a stalemate, and the administration was desperately searching for ways to reverse the Taliban momentum. There were too few U.S. and other foreign troops and Afghan national security forces to cover the vast rural highlands and plateaus that make up most of Afghanistan's terrain. So it made sense to try a local security initiative. That meant recruiting the tribes, communities united by cultural, economic, and blood ties, which have traditionally secured their valleys and practiced consensus leadership through tribal councils. Tribesmen would be trained, armed, and paid to defend their home turf. What a better way for them to earn honor? General David Petraeus, soon to become the top commander in Afghanistan, was impressed by Jim's paper, so impressed that he ordered it become required reading for all his subordinate commanders in Afghanistan. Admiral Eric Olson, head of all Special Operations Forces, was equally impressed and referred to Jim as his Lawrence of Afghanistan. Petraeus, Olson, and General Stanley McChrystal, then in charge in Afghanistan, plucked Jim out and sent him to Afghanistan to help implement the strategy. I joined Jim on this incredibly promising mission, the challenge of his lifetime, to capture and document what happened. American Spartan is the story of Jim's passion for that mission and the bonds of loyalty between him and his men, both Afghan and American. It is also the story of our love, born out of common pain and experience in wartime, and out of a shared desire to do something good for the Afghan people and ultimately help stanch the shedding of American and Afghan blood. What happened? Would Jim's ideas work on the ground with the tribes? We moved into the Mudwalled Kalat with the Safi tribe in February 2012. At the time, Jim was betting his life, as well as mine and those of all his men, that his ideas would work. Almost immediately, we faced a critical test. The day before we moved into the Kalat, violent protests erupted some 150 miles to the southwest, outside the U.S. military base at Bagram Airfield. The protests were a reaction to the accidental U.S. military burnings of the Quran. As the demonstrators